So let's start. So welcome everyone. This is week 4 live session, methods of science and posing research questions. So we have Suhail for this session. And I think we haven't got any questions in the discussion forum, but we have got one question in the spreadsheet, which is shared like 3 days before. So if you have any doubts, please post in the live chat or else you can unmute and ask.
Yeah, thanks, Samrita. Actually, the question in the spreadsheet was for somebody else, I think for Manjari maybe. So about flock size and phenotypic clumping. So please do, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat here. I'll do a very quick recap of the lecture that I did so that you have time to think about possible questions to ask. So the idea was, because the course on ornithology is not just about birds, but about how to do research on birds. So we have, at least I'm going to be giving several lectures on research methodology. The first of which is about what the methods of science are and what tools science uses, scientific research uses. And the second part of this lecture that we're discussing today is how to frame questions. So typically we start with a question in scientific research. I'll have a couple of other lectures, one on research design, study design, which is coming later. And then finally, there are a couple of lectures on basics of data visualization and analysis. Okay, so all of these lectures are not specifically about ornithology, but more about how one does research in ecology more broadly. So if we take ecology, evolution, animal behavior as an umbrella. So this on week 4 the lecture we'll be talking about, and I think Dr. Manjari, who also gave a lecture, she'll be interacting with you live at a later date. Amrita, do we know when that is?
Yeah, so she'll be coming live on 19th of Feb, where
19th
she'll
is
take 2
Thursday.
lectures, like week 4 and week 5 lectures live session.
Okay, live session on the 19th, so double billing. So today we'll just talk about my lectures from the previous week, which is about methods of science and posing research questions. And I don't know, we had normally taught about science in school and college as a set of facts about the world, But actually, science is a way of doing. It's a way of asking questions and answering questions about the world, not a set of facts. So the outcome of science may be a set of facts and a set of theories about, so a set of facts about the world and a set of theories about how the world works together. What leads to what are the causes and effects and things like that. And so what's actually exciting about science is how we can find out those answers to the questions. And to do that, we need to understand what are some of the tools of science. And so in the lecture, I talk about some of the aims of science being to describe the world, to what is in the world. Yeah, so that's simple. I go here and there and I look at what species there are and what their color is and so on. So various forms of description, and that's really important. But then we might also want to know why things are the way they are. So then we have explanation. So we want to know why there are more species of birds in the tropical region than in temperate regions. We might want to know why a bird has this particular bright color, whereas other birds have got dull colors. So these are all questions about the explanation behind the things that we see. Why, when a certain change is happening in the habitat, why do some species decline, but other species increase? So all of these are things about explanation, going beyond the description. Then we might want to predict what will happen in the future, right? So when under climate change, what's going to happen to birds? Will different birds be affected differently, etc., etc.? So this is about forecasting or prediction into the future. There are 3 broad aims of science. And so when we articulate our goals or our questions in science, typically they would come under one of these three broad aims. And then we also need to know a little bit about the tools of science. So the basic tool is observation. So we go out and simply look at the world. We might observe individual species. We might observe patterns of groups of species. We might observe patterns of populations, and so on. Right? So there's individual birds, there's populations, which are collections of the same species. Then there are communities, which are collections of different species that interact in some way in the same time and space. So that's individual ecology, population ecology, community ecology. Under individual ecology also comes animal behavior. How do individuals behave and interact with one another? And then you can look at even higher groups of organizations. Above the communities might look at biogeography. How are the ranges of species and how do ranges of species overlap to form biogeographical patterns? And why do we have those biogeographical patterns? So one biogeographical pattern is, let's take the whistling thrushes. We have the blue whistling thrush in the Himalayas. We have the Malabar whistling thrush in the Western Ghats. Very closely related species, but they're separated by large areas where there are no whistling thrushes altogether. So how can we have sister species of whistling thrushes in these two different geographically distant places? And so we have to come up with some hypotheses, some ideas about maybe some connectivity in the past in terms of the habitat. And then over time, that connectivity was broken, and then these two subpopulations have evolved into different species. So that's a hypothesis, and then how can we test that hypothesis, right? So simply dreaming up an explanation is not enough. We have to find predictions. So this is where the hypothetico-deductive method comes in, where you might have some hypothesis, some articulation of an explanation, and then we need to derive predictions from that. So if the habitat was connected, then what evidence can we find in the current world? If it was connected in the past, what can we find in the current world? And so on. So we have the hypothetico-deductive method, which is a tool that we have to allow us to answer questions, especially questions that we cannot directly observe. We cannot go back in time and see the split in these species. We only have the current day moment. So we're trying to hypothesize, we're trying to have an explanation about something that is unobservable, a historical phenomenon. Nevertheless, it comes within the realm of scientific inquiry. So that's where the hypothetical-deductive method is useful, and of course there are other examples given in the lectures. And then we also have, especially because there is a big problem in scientific inference about cause and effect, and very often we want to know about cause and effect. We have a problem about how to infer cause. And as given in the lecture, even if we have a relationship between two quantities, if we have the example given there was about monkeys and the primatologist, and we have a positive relationship between where the primatologist goes and where the monkeys are. And it's very easy to fall into the trap of seeing it from one perspective and concluding that that is the correct perspective. So the people that I talked about, the local people in the example in the lecture, they thought that wherever the primatologist goes, the monkeys come. And so they said, you can't come here anymore because these monkeys are bothering us. But from our perspective, researchers, we might say the opposite is true, that wherever the monkeys are, there the primatologist goes. So it's the reverse causation. It's not the original causation. Primatologist is influencing the monkey's behavior. It's the reverse causation. The monkey is influencing the primatologist's behavior. And then for completeness, we need to think of the third possibility, that there's some underlying third thing or many other things that we haven't considered that may be separately influencing monkeys and the person who studies monkeys. And so when we have this idea about cause and effect, it's not sufficient to just look at a correlation and conclude from there. We have to ideally, if it's possible, to do an experiment. And the logic of the experiment is that if X is causing Y, then if I change X, then Y should change accordingly. But if X is not causing Y, then if I change X, nothing is going to happen in Y. Or if the opposite is true, then also nothing will happen. I have to change Y and then I'll see a change in X. Correct? Or if there's some third thing or some other fourth, fifth, sixth thing, then I have to change that. I have to manipulate or change that in the world so that, and then I might see a change in Y. So there's the idea about an experiment where the researcher goes in to change some part of the world and to look at the what outcome, what happens, what the consequence of that change is. And only if there is some consequence of the change, then we can conclude there's a cause and effect relationship. So why is a bird bright? Well, a bird is bright to attract mates, right? That is my hypothesis. Now, I can't just go away and say my job is done. I have to see whether that is true. And a prediction from that hypothesis is that if I artificially make this bird dull colored, which I can do, I can catch it and paint its feathers with some dull color. Or if I have it in captivity, then I can put a screen between the bird, let's say the male bird and the female bird, and that screen, that glass screen, I can make that glass screen so that it makes the color look dull, right? And then if it's actually brightness that the females are looking for, then females should lose interest in this male. Or ideally in an experiment, you always have a contrast. You have a male that is shown as bright as in nature, and you have a male that is shown with either dull paint, or with a screen that blocks some of the light. And then we should see the female should show more interest, if my hypothesis is true, more interest in the bright male and less interest in the dull color male. And in fact, people have done this, and they have done this to find out that in some species, the males and females both choose each other on the basis of brightness. So females prefer bright males and males prefer bright females. And they've also done, for example, in the blue throat, a bird that migrates from Western Europe or Northern Europe, Northern Eurasia, that this selection is done on the basis of the ultraviolet reflection of light. And the ultraviolet reflection of light, of course, we cannot see, but birds can see. And so if you paint their bright colored feathers with a UV blocking paint, and it only blocks the ultraviolet wavelengths, then although the birds look equally bright to us, the females still distinguish among the UV blocked males and the unblocked males. And the males, similarly, they also have a mutual mate choice. They distinguish between females that are UV blocked versus those that are not UV blocked. So you see how one can use experiments in animal behavior, in ecology, and so on, to try and understand the actual cause and effect, to pin down cause and effect, which is very difficult to do through simple observation. So we had observations, we have a hypothetical deductive method, we have experimentation. I don't talk about much in the lecture, but there's also modeling. So using simple models of the world to refine our understanding and hypotheses. Usually nowadays, those models of the world will involve some mathematics, but it can even be a verbal model or a graphical model. And basically what modeling does is it makes us write down in a formal sense what it is we think is happening in this system, what we think is happening with mate choice, or what we think is happening with the relationship between the number of bird species and the size of a habitat fragment. Why should, as the habitat increases in size, why should there be more bird species? What do we think is underlying that? And we can use a graphical argument or a mathematical argument. And what that does is it brings out some assumptions that we will be making. And then we have to examine whether those assumptions are warranted. Is there any evidence to back up those assumptions? And it also brings out new features of the system. Once we put our informal reasoning that's in our head, when we put it down on paper. So the advantage of putting things down on paper, this reasoning, this modeling, I'm going to call it, whether it's verbal, graphical, or mathematical modeling, is to bring out unexamined features of the system, to maybe create new predictions that might flow if this model is correct, to create different alternative models for what we are interested in. What explains the number of species in a place? Well, is it the habitat quality? Is it the habitat quantity? How would habitat quality increase the number of species? How would resources increase the number of species? Is it about the interaction between species in different niches or competing with each other? Or is it independent of how species interact with each other? So there's lots of nuance that would go into these things. But in the lecture, I don't talk that much about modeling, and we won't talk about all that much today as well. But that you should know that that's also a tool that scientists use to get closer to answering the questions that they care about. The second part of the lecture is about framing research questions. And in that, I lay out a framework that involves a hierarchy, where we start with a broad idea of what we're interested in and what question we want to ask. And through a series of sort of steps of thinking, we need to narrow down that broad idea into some questions that are specific enough that we can then go out and actually tackle them. You can't go out into the world and say, I'm going to answer this broad question. That's extremely difficult or impossible to do. But you can say, if I can break it down into a series of specific questions, now I know I can go out and tackle question 1, and tackle question 2, and tackle question 3. And then if I put all the answers to those questions together, 3, 4, 5, 6, however many questions there are, then I'll get some idea about the broader phenomenon that I care about. Yeah, so in the lecture, I give this framework where, of course, we start with what are your motivations, what is it that you want to do in your research, what do you want to find out in a broad sense, and then you need to articulate some kind of goal, let's say for a thesis, master's thesis or bachelor's thesis or PhD thesis. And that goal itself can be broken down, will tend to be a larger question, will need to be broken down into multiple objectives. And then to answer each objective, you may have to carry out one or more specific tasks. And I've illustrated all that. No, don't want to go through it again here, but I illustrated that through the lecture. And I ended with an example of going through this research cycle with reference to an associate of mine had done a simple experiment on whether quail eggs are mimic crow eggs, and using an experiment to find that out, right? So there's some principles of experimental design, some principles of hypothetical deductive method, some ways in which you take a large question, break it down into subparts, and once you have the answer to the subparts, how do you put them together and go back, complete the cycle, and come up with some answer to that broader goal level question that you asked. So these were some thoughts and ideas and tricks and tools to how we approach scientific research in the first place. As a preliminary to the next lecture that you will see from me a few weeks down is on, now that we know what our question is, now how do we design the study so that we can answer the question? Because you can't go out and start collecting information and collecting data unless you know why you're collecting that information, for which you need to have the question. And how do you collect that information? You need a particular think about various aspects of study design, which we'll leave for next time. So yes, so we have one question here, Devalina. How do you inculcate the ability in young students, please? Devalina, I don't know what level of students you are thinking of. Are you thinking of
Uh,
school level or college, or what are you?
yes, good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Mhm.
Okay. So basically, I wanted to ask from the age group of 18 to 21, when they're just starting out into the field, they're totally novice and
Yeah.
they have a lot of enthusiasm. It is not to curtail their enthusiastic approach towards asking question, but, at times it gets overwhelming to direct them towards the right way, if I can put it that way, because what we are covering is much more scientific and probably more suited for somebody little older, right? When they're starting out,
Yeah.
how do you really, if there is something that can help guide students?
I think that's a really good question. I think, and I'll suggest an answer to you, and I think that answer is relevant at any stage, even at younger ages for younger children, and also for the older people among us. And that is, the first thing is that to encourage questions. So we want people, all of us, young people, old people, we want people to be curious about the world. What is happening here? How is that taking place? I'm seeing this in the world. Why is that happening? So, for example, I take children and young people out for bird walks, nature walks quite often. And one very common question is, why do birds sing? Very common question, because we hear bird song and bird calls all around us. So why do birds make this sound? And of course, as a ornithologist, as a scientist, I am always tempted to blurt out the answer. And often we don't have enough time, so I'll say some answer. But in a college context or in a school context, for example, it's very useful to just sit back and say, oh, that's really interesting. What do you think? What may be the reason why birds call? And once we ask the question back to them, then they themselves, the same person, may come up with, oh, they might call because they're calling to their friends, which is a perfectly legitimate answer. Or they may call because there's some danger around, which is another legitimate answer. Or they may call because some people may say they're searching for a mate. Or they may call because they are trying to repel any competitors, any intruders that may come in their territory. So there are four possibilities already, which hopefully they would have come up with. And they're all legitimate. And in fact, there may be others which are kind of weird even. I mean, I don't know. They may call because they're calling to God, perhaps. I've never heard that explanation from anybody, but perhaps it may come up. And that's fine. We don't have to distinguish right now between what you've called scientifically relevant and scientifically not relevant. We can just take all possible explanations at face value, and we can say, okay, now suppose, I mean, I don't know the answer to this question. How would we find out the answer to this question? How would you find out if it is your task, you're curious about this? How would you find out? How do you know? How would you try and distinguish between whether they're calling to a mate or they're calling to a competitor or they're calling to their friends or they're calling because there's some danger? How do you know? And through that, we can start to work through and say, for example, if they're calling to a mate, well, maybe they should do that only in the breeding season because birds have breeding seasons. Most birds don't breed all through the year. So we should see more of that kind of song or call during the breeding season. Or if they're calling to alert for danger, then only if there's some danger around, let's say a snake or a predatory bird that is like a hawk, a shikra is around, then only they call. And then we can go a little more in detail. We can say, oh, but can we, if it's calling for danger, can we induce that? Can we get a rubber snake from the shop? And can we tie a string and make it climb up the tree? And can we see if the call happens when they see the rubber snake? And so on. And so I think we can, through that, and then some questions they'll be able to find out through this sequence that some questions we cannot find out the answers to. So for example, if they say, this is a, they say, oh, they're calling to the glory of God, let's say, which I suppose in some age people used to think that. And they say, okay, if that is true, then how would we, as scientists, how could we try and test that? How could we build evidence for or against that argument? And I think, I'm assuming, if we follow that through, there is no real way to tell whether they're calling to God or not calling to God. And if there is no way to tell, then that is not a scientific question. That is, science cannot bring its methods to answering that question. So you may believe or not believe they're calling to God, but science is not able to bring any evidence towards it. So then we'll say, let's keep that aside. This is not a scientific question, or there's no way to get a scientific answer to that question. So let's keep that aside and let's focus on the ones where we can actually bring some evidence. We can intervene in the system, or we can compare different situations and find out. So I feel, Devalina, that from the age of 6, 8, all the way to 80, I think we can continually, encourage questions about, where is this, what is this, why is this, how is this? And encourage also the next logical step, which is, what are some possible answers to this question? And the step after that is, well, for each of these different answers, can we find a way in which you can bring some evidence for or against that particular explanation? That is, in fact, exactly the method that a scientist might use, exactly the method that we would use here. And you're just getting students or children, young people, used to the idea of following the entire sequence through, rather than just asking the question and somebody giving the answer. That's, in the short term, that works fine, but that doesn't inculcate any scientific understanding or temper in people. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I have a follow-up question, if I may ask.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so we have tackled with the part with questioning and how to direct, but what happens more often than not in young children, especially Gen Z that we talk about, they don't like the boring stuff. So the moment they realize, trying to look for answers can be boring, they give up on that. So, I mean, can there be something to bridge the gap, or I don't know. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all generations. Um, Gen Z, I think, anyway, without going into which generation this is, I think unless the students are already on a research track, in which case, presumably, they are interested enough that they should be engaged. If they are not on a research track, if you're talking to some general students, maybe who are not even science students, because I think the methods of science, everybody should know and understand, whether they're a commerce student or a literature student or whatever else, because the methods of science are universal and people should know what those methods are, especially when they are consuming science. Everybody's influenced by science and technology, and they shouldn't treat it as some kind of magic that happens. Science, in fact, should be opposite of magic, that there is a set of methods and anybody can use those methods. I think maybe what we can do is the important thing is to engage them as much as possible. So we should engage their intellect and their creativity as much as possible. This is difficult or impossible to do in large classes. So if there are 100 students in front of you, it's very, very difficult to do. But if there are 10 or 20 students, then let's say in terms of color or in terms of, let's say the song we were talking about, you say, okay, if you were a bird trying to attract a mate, you sing a song. Let them sing, right? Or if you wanted to communicate danger, how would you do that? How would you design? If I'm a designer who was going to design this, then how would you design the most effective song to attract a mate? How do you design the most effective sound to warn others of danger, and so on? So sort of put them into that situation, make them imagine that they are actually in that situation. We can use with caution some amount of anthropomorphism, which is to ascribe human emotions and feelings to the birds, let's say, or to trees or insects or whatever else. Because that's a really good way for people to come up with possible explanations. If you ask a student, if you were in that situation, what would you do? Or if you were in that situation, how you design this particular creature and its calls and its colors? By putting ourselves in that situation, I think it becomes more interesting. If we keep nature or the phenomenon that we care about at a distance all the time, then we don't feel any connection. No? We don't feel any sense of closeness to that particular situation. I'm giving a very vague kind of thing, Revelina. I don't know if this will work in different contexts. And some questions also, some context may be more interesting. If you ask why birds sing, that may be a more interesting question for people to tackle, compared with why are there more species in this habitat versus that habitat? You know what I mean? Questions about animal behavior tend to get people more interested and more excited. Then the more abstract questions about populations declining or community ecology and so on. So if you do want to get people interested in those things, it's often very useful to start with the question about animal behavior. You ask, if you're a bird in its habitat, what do you think is the best way to find food? Do you think the best thing is to specialize on one particular food or to be a generalist on different foods? I think these things, because they gel more with our personal individual experience, they have a better chance of engaging students. And once students then are engaged like that, then we can say, okay, now you're not just one bird, but it's a collection of birds. And as a group, how do you think, birds should behave as a group? Why should birds live in a group in the first place? And then we can gradually build up to that, maybe to populations of birds and communities, which is multiple species and so on. It's a challenge. I don't deny that. We have to use all of our own creativity in trying to make these things as interesting and enjoyable, and at the same time intellectually challenging and creatively challenging to our students. One thing just to say about the creative side of things, it's a very unfortunate notion that the creative endeavors don't include science. That we have literature and we have art of various kinds, and those are highly creative. But the people who think more rationally and less creatively, they should be scientists. And that's completely untrue. I think rationality and creativity have equal role in arts as in science, but they have different roles, but the equal roles. You cannot be an artist, you cannot write a effective novel that is completely irrational, where the story doesn't work, where there isn't any actual logical relationship between the characters in the story, for example. So you need to be rational but creative. And in science, you need to be rational because you are thinking about a particular phenomenon and you are bringing whatever is known about that phenomenon. But at the same time, you need to be really creative in thinking about new answers and new solutions to problems that people have been thinking about for many years. That's the only way you'll advance science, by thinking creatively about how about different answers to the problem and how to tackle that. For example, in experimental science, in the lab, people are constantly thinking creatively, how can I design a better experiment, a more fine-tuned experiment to answer this question? Involves a lot of creativity. So sorry, that was a bit of a digression. The point is, when talking to students, how do we involve all the faculties that they love to use? How do we involve their intellect? How do we involve their creativity? How do we involve their problem-solving skills? And if we are able to do that, then I'm sure they will come along with us, uh, especially if we are able to make the problem a little more personalized. If they can see themselves as closer to the problem rather than some distant thing that I have no relationship with, or I have no connection to. So it's a big challenge as teachers how to do this, but I think there are ways to do it, and we just have to keep going at it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Devalina. Thank you. I've been talking for a long time. Anybody else wants to add, or any other questions or comments?
Thanks, Suhail. Actually, I was going to share a thought on the same, like how to, how to share students, to build a habit of asking questions. And as you said, the questions come from observations, and the observations, like as your second part of the lecture says, like we should assume the assumptions. So what are the assumptions? So when I'm asking a question, I should first think about what are the possible answers, right?
Yeah.
Like based on that, when I build a question, it's easier to the testability of the questions in research. So yeah,
In fact,
even I
once
had the yeah.
I was just going to say, Amrita, in fact, once you start thinking about the possible answers, you sometimes realize that the question as you phrased it uh, is not the best way. And you'll go back and rephrase the question also. Especially there will be questions that you phrase in such a way that are very difficult or impossible to answer. You say, wait, this is not a question that I can tackle. Let me change the question. So that's why the process of asking and answering questions, it's not linear. It's not like, okay, I'm going to start with my goal. This is what I want to achieve. And in a very rational and linear way, you'll say, okay, then I need to do this, then I need to do that, and everything will be done. It's not like a recipe where I can read from a recipe book, and at the end of it, I'll come up with a lovely cake. Actually, you have to look at all the ingredients and then say, for example, I don't have this ingredient, I don't have that ingredient, I don't have an oven, so therefore I can't make this particular dish. So is there some other dish I can make that is similar to this that I still am interested in? So you also have some constraints, right? So there'll be a back and forth. You're not going to start cooking before you're sure that all the ingredients are there, right? So you look at the recipe, and you yourself have to write the recipe. Somebody is not writing the recipe for you.
Yes.
I don't know if this metaphor makes sense, but doing effective research in an efficient way means that there's a lot of thinking and preparation to be done before even you start doing the experiments or data collection or so on. I think once people start doing some research and they find that getting stuck in some place, they'll see this. For those, if people here have not done any research, all this will seem very abstract. But if you have done and you've grappled with some of these problems, then you say, okay, this makes sense to me.
I think this is very important because people, students especially find it struggling. Like whenever they get a project or PhD, they're asking. They're finding difficult to frame a questions.
Yes.
Even though they have a lot of questions, they don't
Yes.
know. How the like what you said.
Yeah.
It's like shifting, reframing questions on a
Yes.
testable way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is really significant to understand how to frame a question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Suhail, for sharing.
Sure. I think that, I mean, roughly half of the students in the ornithology course are actually non-academics. They are enthusiast bird watchers and so on. If by chance any of them are here in this conversation, which I assume not many would be, because this is more for the researchers. But as a bird watcher, as an enthusiast, I think even there, especially because it's not for your bread and butter, it's even more liberating to go out and see some strange behavior and ask, why is that the case? How odd that this bird that normally eats insects, or sorry, normally eats nectar like sunbirds, why is it going and hunting for spiders? Or a bird that is thought to be restricted to this particular habitat, why am I seeing suddenly a few individuals in another habitat? Or why are these fighting? Or, so, and I think that again, rather than immediately asking some so-called expert, what is the answer to this question? I think it's more fulfilling to first think of some possible answers ourselves. And then even though we may not be researchers and may not follow through, but it's much more fulfilling and rather than, just immediately just getting an answer. This is the problem with our education system. You ask the teacher the question, the teacher gives the answer. And if the teacher doesn't know the answer, the teacher says, oh, that's a silly question. Typically that's what will happen in our schools. Rather than the teacher saying, oh, that's really interesting. I don't know the answer to this question, which of course is fair. No single person can know the answer to all questions. Let's find out together and let's go look up and do some research and find out this thing. So anyway, that's just a small suggestion to our non-academic, non-research focused people if they happen to be listening over here.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dr. Suhail.
Yes, hi.
I am one of those people who is actually a non-birder, actually an engineer.
Excellent, yeah.
And I went through your video and it was very interesting. What you told there in the video is actually not restricted to birding or zoology. It goes to all the fields, including science and engineering.
Yes.
So what I wanted to understand was presently in ornithology, as per your knowledge, what kind of research is being carried out in our country? Some typical topics which you remember either being carried out or which have been done.
It's the entire spectrum of work. I'll just describe that and I'll give you a suggestion also. So generally in what we call organismal biology, where we are interested in the study of whole organisms, not within. So for example, there's all the biotechnology and biochemistry and so on is about what is happening inside the body. But typically when we are interested in the organism itself, we are interested in questions about behavior. What does the organism do and why does it do and what influences the behavior? We are interested in questions about, so that's of individuals. Then we have groups of individuals, which we call populations of the same species. And then we have groups of species, which we call communities, and then at biogeography at larger and larger scales. So there's an entire span of scales. And the questions that are being asked are across this entire span. So for example, there are some questions about migration and what controls migration. And some people are looking at it from a physiological point of view. What are the hormones that switch on the migratory behavior? And in turn, what makes those hormones increase? So for example, in migratory birds, we think that it is the day length, the changing day length that makes the hormone production more or less of some of these hormones that control migration. So when as you know, in summer and winter, the day length changes. And unconsciously, the birds are recording this day length, the same thing that plants do. Plants flower and fruit based on changes in day length. But here, the researchers are looking at the physiological underpinnings. There are some researchers looking purely at behavior, like for example, what happens in cooperative groups like with the babblers, the Saat Bhai, Seven Sisters, the babblers, and what are these groups composed of? How do they organize themselves? What is their social structure? How do they help each other? Are there any conflicts in the group? So at the level of behavior. Then there are questions to do with populations. Why are some populations increasing? Is it because habitats are increasing? Is it because protection is there? Why are some populations decreasing? Is it because of poisoning? Then there are questions at the level of communities, which is sets of species. So why do some places have many species? Some places, for example, why does Northeast India have so many species? And why does Peninsular India have fewer species? Or if you go from east to west in the Himalaya, why does the number of species decrease? And which kinds of species tend to drop out as you go from east to west? So what I can suggest to all of you, actually, Amrita, we should do this. Some of us, over the last few years, we put together a paper actually on, I think it's called 101 Key Questions in Indian Ornithology. And we have curated a set of 101 research questions specifically about birds, which this group of people, some 20, 30 people together, we thought are particularly interesting in the coming years about birds. So it has to do with urbanization and climate change and including many other things. It's a freely downloadable document. So maybe we'll put it in the discussion group after this. Yeah, that may be useful for everybody to look through and just to see the kinds of things that people are thinking of as vital kind of questions for the future.
Right. That will be interesting. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. There is a question from Shruti, not a researcher, curious to know. Fluctuations integrated into a data collection is informed by those changes and analysis is accurate. So the long-term studies, Shruti, typically one of the reasons to do long-term studies is so that one can uncover long-term changes. Very often when we study a system for 1 or 2 or 3 years, we understand it partly, but incompletely. So, for example, my colleagues have been monitoring bird populations in Spiti district of Himachal Pradesh in the Trans-Himalaya for the last 20, I think about 25 years now. And so every year they go out and they, along defined transects and so on, they count the birds. And what they found was that suppose they had done a typical duration project, 3 to 5 years, they would have seen, they would have concluded, oh, these species are declining, these species are increasing. But actually what they found is over the long term, actually you see lots of fluctuations. So the species that were declining in the first 5 years actually increased in the next 5 years, and they went through lots of fluctuations. So in the long term, many of those species are actually relatively stable, but fluctuating. So they would have come to completely the wrong conclusion if they had only done the study over 3 to 5 years. They would have sounded the alarm and said that these species are declining and so on and so forth. So in the long term, it's really important to know what is happening over the long term. The challenge is now, if we see that there are fluctuations or we see that there's a decline or increase, how do we understand the underlying causes of those changes? So is it because the temperature is increasing from year to year? Is it because precipitation is changing? Is it because habitat is changing? There's no straightforward answer to this. How do we relate particular changes to their underlying causes? It's a subject of a lot of research, and it's difficult to tease apart the underlying factors. But of course, that is an important thing to do. For example, if you want to know, you may know that across India, the population of birds of prey, raptors, is declining on average. Now, is that because habitats have been destroyed? Or is it because of poisoning by pesticides? So typically these birds of prey are not directly poisoned by pesticides, but the pesticides would be eaten by insects. Insects would be eaten by insectivorous birds, and those insect-eating birds would be eaten by the raptors. So there could be a process of bioaccumulation through the food chain, which is very well known in other parts of the world, but we don't know it in our context. So if it's habitat change versus bioaccumulation of pesticides, which of these is the right answer is really important to know for us to take conservation action. We can't take effective conservation action if we don't know what the underlying cause is. The long-term studies for these sorts of things is really, really crucial, coupled with the more directed studies about, for example, collecting these birds, taking the tissue samples, looking at the pesticide levels, seeing whether mortality is higher in places where pesticide use is higher and lower in places where pesticide use is lower, etc., etc. So And then, as you say, new factors might come in. That in some place there may be no intensive agriculture for some time, and then suddenly, now paddy is being grown and there's intensive agriculture, irrigation, and so on, and now pesticides are coming in. Or in the case of vultures, as you know, in the mid-90s, they started declining. And that's because a new thing came into the system, which is this veterinary drug diclofenac. And the diclofenac suddenly was completely new. Nobody had any idea that this would cause such massive mortality in vultures. So the long-term studies are also very important to be able to pick up on early, as soon as something new happens and some new catastrophe is coming about, to pick up on that is to be able to respond to that. Shruti, I'm not quite sure whether that has kind of addressed what you meant, but you're welcome to unmute and add a little more if you want to add more nuance to that. Okay, that's great. Yeah, and Amrita, thanks for posting the PDF there.
I hope it's the same. Yeah.
Yeah, you took it from that bioarchive
Yes,
site.
yes, the same.
Yeah, it's on
Yes.
bioarchive, correct. Yeah. Yeah. I have a direct message by Russell. I don't know why you sent me a direct message, but I'll read it out. I'm a first year BSc zoology student. I want to know about career opportunities in ornithology. So one additional thing, Amrita, if you don't mind, from the ornithology.in website, if you can put the link to the guidelines that we have, the advice for career in ornithology. So again, one of the things that we've tried to do is put together career advice for those who are interested in ornithology. I should say that career advice applies equally to any other branch of ecology. It could be mammals or insects or whatever else. We have not talked in that particular set of documents much about career opportunities. We've only said very broadly there are many opportunities. But Russell, just to say that the broadly speaking, what we are talking about here is research. Ornithology meaning research on birds. So in a research career, there tend to be broadly 2 or 3 sets of opportunities. One is in academics. So you can become a professor, like Amrita has become in an academic institution and do research and teaching. So there's an academic track. Then there is a research outside academia, and a lot of research on birds and other wild animals in India happens outside academia within research institutions and within NGOs. Like the NGO that I'm part of, Nature Conservation Foundation, we are primarily a research and conservation organization, and we do all the same things that academic institutions do. We have PhD students, we publish papers, and so on. And finally, increasingly, I think in the government, in the forest departments and in the tiger reserves and so on in different places, there are increasingly positions of research biologists, research positions where you can potentially get a job as a research biologist in one of the forest departments or the tiger reserves or the sanctuaries. So that is as far as research opportunities are. With birds more broadly, of course, there are so many ways in which one can build a career as a communicator, a writer, an artist, somebody who does education and outreach about birds. There are architects who worry about bird-friendly design in architecture. There would be similarly with engineers as well. Many of the things, the practical things that we do on the ground have an impact on wild populations of birds and other species. So there is always an intersection between that. In law, there are people who specialize, as you know, in environmental law, which has to do with conservation and wildlife and other aspects of environment. So even if one doesn't do research on birds, there are so many ways in which one's career, you can create a career that intersects with a sort of conventional field on the one hand and intersects with ornithology or wildlife on the other hand. Yeah, so that's a broad answer. I hope that's useful. Yes, Amrita, I aren't any questions here. I may have to go in a minute or two. Amrita, you're going to say something? Sorry.
No, I was saying, I think that's all about today's session. Actually, we have planned 1 hour session for 2 lectures, but Manjari will be available for the social behavior live session on 19th Feb, which is Thursday. So you can post questions on the spreadsheet, which will be shared by tomorrow. So she'll be going live session for social behavior and vocal behavior. And yeah, thank you so much, Suhail, for being with us, and thank you so much.
Sure. Very
Yeah.
welcome. Thanks all of you. And if there are any further questions, please put it in the discussion group, and
Yes.
I'm happy to interact there as well. Shruti, I'll just stay online and send you the Amrita, maybe you can post the link to the bioarchive.
Yeah, I'll post the link. Yeah.
For Shruti over there.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll take my leave then. Thank you all.
Sure.
Take care. Stay excited. Stay curious. Bye.
Thanks, Suhail.
Bye bye.
Bye. Shruti, are you able to get the link now? Like just now, I shared a link, bioarchive link. So please go. Yeah, you can download the PDF from there. Yeah, thank you so much. And we'll meet you by February 19th, Thursday, for the week 5 live session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.